In a scene described by one investigator as reminiscent of a weird religious rite, 5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of Miss Tate and her husband, screen director Roman Polanski. Miss Tate, who starred in Valley of the Dolls, was 8 months pregnant and was found in a bikini-type nightgown with a rope around her neck attached to the body of a man.
The 1960s and 70s saw the upheaval of American culture and the evolution of a generation. The Vietnam War shaped the way America's youth viewed their nation, in some cases producing violent vigilantes alongside the peace-driven hippies. Charles Manson emerged from the turmoil of his own life and the nation with 2 missions: to secure a record deal and to bring about helter-skelter, an apocalyptic race war. He, along with his devoted followers, would attempt to do so through the murders of several individuals. Manson was born in Cincinnati, Ohio on November 11, 1934, to a 16-year-old single mother. When his mother was jailed for armed robbery, Manson was sent to live with relatives, then shuffled from foster home to foster home until he eventually began a life of petty crimes, which landed him in reform schools and eventually prison. While in prison, he learned to manipulate both the inmates and the officers, read about Scientology, and learned to play the guitar. Finally, in 1967, Manson stayed out of prison and moved to the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, California, where he focused his efforts on landing a record career. He was 32 years old and had spent the better part of 17 years in federal prisons.
While waiting on the beginning of his career, Manson began to assemble his family of followers, focusing on recruiting fellow outcasts, especially young women, who fell victim to his charisma and views in spirituality. When asked if Manson forced the family members to steal, Susan Atkins said, "No, I took it upon myself. We get programmed to do things by Charlie, but it's hard for me to explain it so that you see the way I see. The words that would come from Charlie's mouth would not come from inside him. They would come from what I call the infinite." Susan Atkins. Eventually, Manson wrote a song that was recorded by the Beach Boys and established his commune on the Spa Movie Ranch. The turmoil of the late 1960s further darkened Manson's deteriorating mental health, and he began to foretell a race war, which he named Helter Skelter, in which the United States would become engulfed and only Manson and his family would survive the turmoil. By 1969, Manson's hold on those around him had solidified until his family acted on his orders and murdered 7 individuals. On August 9, 1969, Manson sent 4 of his followers, Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krankwinkle, and Linda Kasabian, to the former home of Beach Boys producer Terry Melcher, who refused to sign Manson to his label. Melcher and his girlfriend had moved out of the home weeks earlier, and the house was now leased to film director Roman Polanski and his wife, Sharon Tate. Upon arriving at the house shortly after midnight, Manson's 4 followers shot and stabbed Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, along with 4 other individuals, hairdresser Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and her boyfriend Wojtek Brakowski, and Stephen Perrin. The killers then mutilated the victims and painted words in their blood, leaving a brutal puzzle for investigators. The search began for the perpetrators of a seemingly motiveless crime. The next evening, Manson directed the same 4 followers, adding Leslie Van Houten and Steve Clem Grogan to the group, to the Beverly Hills home of Delano LaBianca and his wife Rosemary, and left a similar scene for the investigators, again with words written in the blood of the victims. It took months before the investigators finally had a breakthrough and arrested Manson and his followers following tips.
The trial hinged on the prosecution's ability to proving Manson's motive. They believed that the ultimate motive behind the brutal murders was to initiate the race war he had foreseen by making the public believe blacks were behind the killings. The trial began on July 24, 1970, and lasted for 9.5 months, making it the longest murder trial up to that point in American history. Several of the members agreed to testify in exchange for leniency, and the prosecution relied heavily on these testimonies. By the end of the 9-month spectacle that included multiple outbursts by Manson and the other defendants, Manson and 3 of his followers who had committed the murders were found guilty and sentenced to death. Upon sentencing, Manson said, "Mr. and Mrs. America, you are wrong. I am not the king of the Jews, nor am I a hippie cult leader. I am what you have made me, and the mad dog, devil killer, fiend leper is a reflection of your society. Whatever the outcome of this madness that you call a fair trial or Christian justice, you can know this. In my mind's eye, my thoughts set fire to your cities." Charles Tex Watson was later also tried and convicted. He too was sentenced to death. In 1972, California overturned the death penalty, and all 5 were sentenced to life in prison instead, which they continue to serve today.
Unfortunately, I think Charles Manson and the Manson family are given more significance than they deserve. In my opinion, they were petty criminals, common criminals. He was an insane, lifelong criminal who took advantage of weak-minded people, either because of drugs or what have you. And I personally, I'm kind of disgusted by all the mythology and reverence that some people seem to have for him. I was very young when this happened, but I do remember these events, and my take was always, this guy is nuts and needs to be. The way I treat people like that is to just ignore them, is my opinion.
Phil.